Good evening, everybody. I'm Steve Parrish, and I'm just thrilled to be able to welcome you here to this incredible facility that we call Westport Library. It's a fantastic organization. Tonight's program is part of the library's Common Ground initiative. And just as a reminder, the Common Ground initiative is for the purpose of building a positive and productive conversation about how we work together to move forward as a civil society and to encourage respectful, constructive dialogue and build capacity to tackle challenging and controversial issues, including those here in Westport. Tonight, we're very privileged to have as our speaker, Ken Feinberg. And I can think of no one anywhere who is better able to, based on his experience and his wisdom, to help us achieve our goals of the Common Ground initiative. Ken went to the University of Massachusetts, and after graduating, attended and graduated from the NYU School of Law. He served as Chief of Staff to Senator Ted Kennedy. He was a federal prosecutor. Today, he is recognized as the most prominent and well-respected mediator and arbitrator in the United States. He is the country's leading expert in alternative dispute resolution. Here's just a few of the incredibly complicated and complex projects and situations that Ken has helped work people through. He was a special master for the Agent Orange payment program. He was the chief administrator of the Hokie Spirit Memorial Fund, which was created in the aftermath of the terrible shootings on the campus of Virginia Tech University in 2007. He was special master of the Troubled Assets Relief Program, TARP, which some people referred to Ken as President Obama's executive pay czar. Ken will have the opportunity in a few minutes to explain why that is not accurate. And he was the administrator of the fund created to compensate the victims of the Deepwater Horizon oil rig explosion in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010. And probably the thing that Ken is most well known for, he was the special master of the September 11 Victim Compensation Fund. He's written 2 books about his experiences. Who Gets What? Fair Compensation After Tragedy and Financial Upheaval. And the second book, What is Life Worth? The Unprecedented Effort to Compensate the Victims of 9/11. That book was made into a movie called Worth, starring Michael Keaton playing Ken Feinberg. I've known Ken for 30 years, and our relationship has been both professional and personal, and he has been a mentor and a friend and an inspiration to me, and we are incredibly lucky that Ken has agreed to join us tonight. So please welcome Ken Feinberg.
Thank you, sir.
Jennifer reminded me to hold the microphone close, so I will try to remember to do that. So here's how, there's so much, as you could tell from my brief introduction, there is so much to Ken and his fascinating career that we could be here for hours on any piece of that. So I'm going to try to keep us focused on things that are directly relevant to the Common Ground initiative, focusing in particular on skills, tools, and learnings, not only that Ken has applied throughout his career, but that hopefully we can take away and use as we think about civil discourse and common ground here in our community. After Ken and I have our little conversation for probably about 40 to 45 minutes, there'll be an opportunity for audience question and answers. If you have a question when it is time, go right over here where the lights are flashing. There is a microphone, and it's important that you go there so that the microphone can capture your question for the audience, the significant audience actually, that is live streaming this event. And then we'll have a few minutes for some concluding thoughts. So, Ken, your career. Senator Kennedy, you originally, I believe, worked for the Senate Judiciary Committee, which Senator Kennedy was the chair of, and then ultimately became chief of staff for Senator Kennedy.
That's correct.
And in the course of your work on the Judiciary Committee and with Senator Kennedy, you ran across a gentleman named Stephen Breyer. Tell me a little bit about him and your relationship.
We were both employees of Senator Kennedy. Stephen Breyer came down from Harvard Law School to work with Senator Kennedy primarily on airline deregulation. If you don't like the way the airlines run today, blame Breyer. He was very pivotal in the decision for the Congress to deregulate the airlines under Senator Kennedy's direction. I worked next door to Stephen Breyer. I was on the Senate, as Steve Parrish mentioned, I worked with Senator Kennedy, for Senator Kennedy, then on criminal justice issues that during the 1970s were a political priority for Senator Kennedy. And Breyer and I became employees together and then lifelong friends, and we're lifelong friends today.
So in your book, you talked about the importance and influence of, excuse me, I'm going to have to call him Justice Breyer, in your career. And you talked about some things that he taught you about how to operate when you were working on behalf of Senator Kennedy. The importance of consulting with the minority on everything.
Full transparency. Stephen Breyer, who was chief counsel of the committee for Senator Kennedy, made sure that every day Senator Kennedy's agenda, his mission, his objectives would be shared with Senator Thurmond, Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, who was the ranking Republican. And Breyer made sure that there were no hidden agreements, no secret gotchas, everybody working together, whether you agreed or not, full transparency, openness in an effort to bridge differences.
And another thing that you mentioned in the book that you were told by Justice Breyer was, our word is our best tool.
Senator Kennedy taught us that. Senator Kennedy told us, if you give your word to a fellow senator or a staff person, your word is your bond, and you don't later on go back on it. You don't later on say, I changed my mind. You walk the plank. And in the political world, that reputation that you develop, that your word, you'll stick by it through thick and thin, very important in promoting respect for your position and your role as a senator or a staffer or a lawyer or anybody else in public life.
Share the credit. What about that?
That was the other thing. Senator Kennedy always shared the credit. If there was a health bill, a labor bill, an education bill, he would make sure that fellow senators were at the center of the announcement, this bipartisan consensus, share the credit. And he also made it clear that the perfect is the enemy of the good. If you get in federal legislation half a loaf, grab it, compromise. The other half will come later. Obamacare is a great example. Obamacare, You get something like that in place, it's here to stay. And you build from that and get more in the interest of your position or your objective.
And tell us a little bit about the importance in that office and on that committee at the leadership level of developing personal relationships, not just at the member-to-member level, but the staff-to-staff.
Critical. Senator Kennedy was lucky. He could stick around on weekends. He didn't have to run home to Massachusetts to lobby, to politic, to raise funds. He was an institution. And that permitted him to stick around on weekends when the Senate wasn't in session and develop friendships with not only fellow Democrats, but Republicans on the other side. And he took those friendships very, very seriously. And he forged friendships with very difficult Republicans like Ted Stevens of Alaska and other very conservative Republicans. And he just felt that part of his job was to try and build bridges with those who might otherwise be against him, but at least on a personal level, sort of diminish the antagonism. And we learned a lot from the way he operated with fellow senators.
Then the other thing that you talked about in the book about your time with Senator Kennedy related to what I guess I would call values that you got directly from the senator. I just mentioned, you already mentioned share the credit, but empathy, compassion, you talked about compromise. Give us a little color on those as well.
Senator Kennedy's personal values migrated to the less fortunate, who didn't have what he had in his family. And he was a champion of trying to empathize, not only with the poor and the dispossessed and those in need, but he had a compassion that reached out to 9/11. 78 people from Massachusetts on that airplane died when that plane took off from Logan Airport in Boston and crashed into the World Trade Center. Senator Kennedy met with every family member who lost a loved one on 9/11 from Massachusetts. And he attended probably 30 funerals of those who died on 9/11. And he just felt a real empathy that that hopefully would ease somewhat the pain of traumatic loss. And you learned a great deal from the way Senator Kennedy practiced the values that were an inherent part of his Constitution. And it was so valuable to me and to Breyer and to others on the staff to learn from that and benefit from that.
And we'll come back a little bit later in some of the other work that you've done to talk about the importance of empathy. But I just, out of curiosity, I hear what you're saying in terms of empathy, in terms of people outside the government. But how did that work with members and Senator Kennedy's dealings with members and their staffs?
Jesse Helms, North Carolina senator, very right-wing senator. Attacked Senator Kennedy all the time on the floor, called him a communist, etc. When Senator Kennedy heard that Jesse Helms' wife was ill with cancer, he walked over to Jesse Helms' Senate office and told him that, Jesse, I heard that your wife is not well. You know, there's a great cancer treatment specialist at Mass General in Boston. Why don't I arrange for your wife to be flown up to Mass General? Helms almost started crying. And from that day on, Helms never publicly went after Senator Kennedy again. And they disagreed, but it was those little acts of kindness when Ted Stevens of Alaska, a irascible, effective Republican senator from Alaska, when he was charged with a crime or whatever it was, he went to Senator Kennedy, will you be a character reference at my trial? Will you vouch for my character? And Kennedy said he would. And that type of empathetic outreach to would-be opponents he was a master. It served him well in the Senate. It certainly served him well in American history. And those of us in his staff learned every day from the way he performed his task as a U.S. Senator.
So you finish your time with Senator Kennedy, and skipping ahead a bit, you become known as an incredibly effective mediator. So first question, what the heck is a mediator?
A mediator is a neutral, somebody who hears both sides of the dispute, doesn't represent either side, represents the neutral effort to reach an agreement. So when you mediate, you hear from each side, you explain to each side the pros and cons of the position, etc., and you try and get the parties voluntarily, no gun to their head, voluntarily, can we reach a peaceful resolution of what has you at odds with each other, without the necessity of trials and lawyers and judges and juries and appeals. And you guys know how the American legal system works. Let's try and resolve this now in an efficient and cost-effective way.
And as opposed to an arbitrator
almost always has the power to enforce a settlement, like judge and jury. An arbitrator, by agreement of the parties, listens to both sides and renders a final decision, which both sides are required and mandated to accept. A mediator doesn't have that power. A mediator tries to get the parties voluntarily to agree to settle their dispute.
So talk a little bit about some of those skills, learnings, and values that you took away from your time with Senator Kennedy and Justice Breyer, and how that influenced your work as a mediator.
The bedrock principles of my mediation practice built on the very values that we discussed a few minutes ago. Empathy. A mediator has to convey an empathetic sensitivity to the position being advanced by each side. You don't side with one over the other. You use your force of empathy, sensitivity, and understanding to try and convince each side of the value of a civil compromise. Doggedness. An effective mediator never gives up. You may start a mediation and the parties say, well, there's no point, we're not going to reach an agreement. You stick with it. Chances are, the longer you keep people involved in the process, human nature being what it is, they have a stake in the outcome. Gradually, they come to realize this is better than rolling the dice with lawyers in the courtroom. It's very important. Creativity. Just like Senator Kennedy managed to forge legislative compromises. an effective mediator comes up with rather creative solutions designed to satisfy all sides to a dispute. It's things like empathy, sensitivity, doggedness, creativity, competence. Those are sort of the principles that guide an effective mediator in his or her chosen task.
Sounds like civil discourse in the pursuit of common ground to me.
Funny that I was invited by Steve Parrish today. That's exactly right. Civility, respect, place yourself in the shoes of your adversary. How does she think? How does he think? And over time, whether it's an hour, a day, a week, over time, you try and, with patience, come up with a peaceful resolution, respect for the parties, something that they can declare is sort of like a win-win.
So I want to skip ahead to the 9/11 fund. Let me try to combine two questions into one question. First is, give us a little bit of the backstory on how you came to be selected as the special master of that fund, and then a quick overview of the legislation that created that fund, what it did, it required, and in some ways, more importantly, what it didn't say and what it didn't do.
13 days after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, Congress passed a law, a new statute, unprecedented in American history. And the law simply said, anybody who lost a loved one on 9/11, the airplanes, the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, or anybody who was physically injured but survived, burns, broken bones, etc., you can voluntarily enter this fund. And this fund, if you're eligible, will compensate you better than if you go to court and sue the airlines or sue the World Trade Center or whatever. Now, if you accept the money, you don't have to. You can decide, I don't want to participate. But if you accept the funds, you sign a release, a piece of paper, I will not sue the airlines, the World Trade Center, etc. So that statute was ready. It was signed by President Bush. Now, the statute said one person shall be appointed by the Attorney General of the United States, John Ashcroft, to design and administer this fund. No courts, no committees, delegation by Congress to one person who decides who gets what. When that law was passed, Senator Kennedy called President Bush. And he said, Mr. President, this law, be very, very careful that you don't politicize this. This was passed by Congress without objection, no vote. Everybody consented. Republicans, Democrats, everybody. And you better keep it apolitical or this could become a nightmare. And for that reason, don't appoint your buddy. Don't appoint some Republican from Texas. You ought to appoint someone like my former chief of staff, Ken Feinberg, the opposite of a Republican from Texas. And it'll be an apolitical, bipartisan, just like Congress. Bush spoke to the Attorney General, John Ashcroft, a former senator with Senator Kennedy. And John Ashcroft interviewed me, and he said, I like your approach. I like what Senator Kennedy suggests. I think that's right. I want this to be apolitical. I want it done on the merits. And I am appointing you. And he turned out to be, without a doubt, to this day, I am in his debt. He backed me up 100%. And without his support, it couldn't have worked. And with his support, we maintained for 33 months a completely bipartisan, apolitical approach to the tragedy. You'd never see this today, never in a million years. But back then, only 25 years ago, less, it worked.
You mentioned 33 months. For 33 months, you worked pro bono.
That's right, you couldn't get, I mean, they were willing to pay me, but how do you get paid for this patriotic undertaking? I mean, can you imagine what families of lost loved ones would say? You're making money on this? I mean, as a practical, pragmatic, patriotic matter, there was no way you could ask to get compensated for this job.
Couple of things about the statute. As I understand it, the statute itself provided no amount of money. It was open-ended. That was for you to decide how much money in total.
All public taxpayer money. No cap. Ken, whatever you think is appropriate, authorized payment. No appeals. The only check we have on your discretion is the political ramifications of a runaway budget. But other than that, you use your best judgment in deciding what is a life worth of those who are dead or injured.
And as I understand it, one of the few restrictions that was placed on you, the special master, was, but by the statute, is you were not to declare that everybody got the same amount.
You couldn't. Remember, you can't pay everybody the same amount if everybody has to sign after they receive their compensation, "I will not sue." So obviously, the minute you say that in a statute, you know that the stockbroker, the banker, the lawyer, the doctor, they're going to get more money, the families, than the waiter, the busboy, the cop, the fireman, the soldier. They earned more, they get more. That's what courts in Westport and Connecticut and around the country do every day in the courtroom. The stockbroker who gets run over by an automobile is going to get a lot more money from the jury than the waiter or the busboy who gets run over by an automobile. That's the American legal system. And I had to confront paying 5,300 victims different amounts of money. And if you don't think that's stressful, that was a horrific obligation that I had to distinguish among various victims who are just as dead or just as physically injured as their next door neighbor is.
So, again, as I understand it, what you were charged to do by the statute was figure it out, decide the amounts, figure out how to do it, however you want to figure it out, just figure it out. There was no requirement upon you to meet with anybody, to talk with anybody, to have hearings. It was just figure it out and then do it. Yet, you conducted more than 900, over those 33 months, more than 900 hearings, meetings with family members, people who were impacted by what happened on 9/11, to help you decide those things. You didn't just try to do it yourself. You listened to the victims.
Congress never wrote into that statute any requirement that that Feinberg, the special master, hold individual confidential hearings with the victims. Our decision in administering this statute to invite people voluntarily, all voluntary, do you want to come and meet privately with Ken Feinberg? before or after, one time, you decide whether or not to accept the compensation that's being offered. Now, when I'm asked all the time, wow, that must have been tough, deciding the value of a life. No. As I've said, courts in the United States do that every single day. They decide, judge and jury decide the value of a life. The American legal system has rather cold calculations for deciding the value of a life. What made the job so stressful, so debilitating, were these, as Steve Parrish mentions, these individual meetings where you invite families that lost loved ones to come in and see me. I'm not a rabbi, I'm not a priest, I'm a government official. But if you want to come in and talk with me privately about a lost loved one, I conducted over 950 separate private hearings with people. And what you hear in those individual hearings is chilling. You can't make it up. And it was by far the single most difficult aspect of the program, was meeting with your fellow Americans and listening to what they want to tell you in private. An example. A 26-year-old woman comes to see me, sobbing. Mr. Feinberg, I lost my husband at the World Trade Center. He was a fireman. And he left me with our two children, 6 and 4. Now, you're going to give me $2.4 million tax-free. I want it in 30 days. I said to her, Mrs. Jones, 30 days, this is public taxpayer money. The U.S. Treasury has to cut the check. It may take 60 days or 90 days, but you'll get your money. No, 30 days. I said to her, Mrs. Jones, why do you need the money in 30 days? Why? I'll tell you why, Mr. Feinberg. I have terminal cancer. I have 10 weeks to live. My husband was going to survive me and take care of our 2 children. Now they're going to be orphans. I have now I've got to get this money. I've got to get a guardian ad litem. I've got to set up an estate. I've got to invest the funds. I've got a lot to do while I still have my faculties. I don't have a lot of time. Help, help. We ran down to the Treasury, walked the check through, got her the money in 30 days. 8 weeks later, she died. And when you get story after story like this, all hideous, horrible, it takes its toll. That was what was difficult. That's what's difficult about a lot of these compensation programs. The emotion that is associated with using money, which is a rather hollow substitute for a loved one. But that's the system. And that was the most difficult part of all of this.
I want to come back to the emotion in just a minute, but first, because I think it relates very directly to civil discourse common ground, I want to throw a name out to you and ask you to tell the story about him, Charles Wolfe.
Well, if you see the movie Worth, Charles Wolfe is played by Stanley Tucci, great actor. Now, there's a certain amount of dramatic license, I must say, in this movie, but Charles Wolfe, in fairness, lost his wife at the World Trade Center. And he came to me and he said, Mr. Feinberg, listen, you're a lawyer, and you're making these calculations about lives and economic loss and pain and suffering, and you're missing the point. Try and be more human about how you go about compensating victims. Hold these hearings. Manage expectations. Tell people personally what you can do and can't do. And as a result of that, and I think the movie goes overboard a bit, but it's true, what turned the 9/11 fund into a success was the personal qualities of the fund reaching out to individuals and inviting them. Come on in. This is not assembly line justice. If you want to chat about anything with Mr. Feinberg, come on in, and he will meet with you and chat with you. And it was essential to the success of the fund, these individual hearings.
You talked about the impact of these individual meetings on you. I want to just read something from your book, What is Life Worth? And just ask if you would mind commenting on it. Here's what you had to say in the book. Compassion has also become more important to me. I think I've become a better listener. I no longer offer advice gratuitously without thinking of consequences. I try to give more careful answers. I try harder to understand the viewpoints of others, and I'm more accepting of human flaws and foibles.
That's absolutely true. I've learned a couple of valuable lessons. When you're meeting with people in grief, the less you say, the better. You become a very good listener. And be careful about offering robotic comments like, I know what you're going through, or I can't begin to tell you how I feel. Stay away from that programmatic stuff, because it doesn't sit well with people who are very personal about their grief. You're much better off inviting them to say whatever they want to say. You know, most people who came to see me, I would say 90% of the people who came to see me with individual meetings, they didn't come to talk about money. Money never entered into it. They either were very, very angry and wanted to vent about life's unfairness. Why my daughter, Mr. Feinberg? She was an angel. She was the love of our life. She's gone. Why? There is no God. No God could allow this to happen. Or another interesting aspect of this, people in grief come to validate the memory of a lost loved one. That's what they want to talk about. Mr. Feinberg, I'm here for my private meeting, and I'm here to tell you that I lost my wife at the World Trade Center. We were married for 25 years, and I want to show you now a video of our marriage 25 years ago. I want to show you the marriage. Well, Mr. Jones, you don't have to do that because it won't have any bearing on compensation. And you're going to watch. I want you to see my angel 25, play the video. Validating the memory of that person. And, you know, I tell all people all the time, sometimes I think a law degree, I would have been better off with a degree in divinity or in psychiatry, because that's what you're dealing with in an attempt to help people be somewhat at peace with the horror of what happened traumatically overnight.
I want to read one other passage from your book, Ken. And as I had told you in the car on the way up here, this was the second time I read Worth. The first time was a number of years ago when it first came out, and then I reread it preparing for tonight. This time, I could only read bits at a time because it was so powerful and so moving with the stories like the ones you just told. So I want to read this last thing that I want to read tonight from your book, and then we're going to move on from 9/11. You write, when I was a young child in Brockton, Massachusetts, my mother told me that, quote, tears are the price of love. Decades later, I witnessed firsthand how grief and love were woven together and how love could overcome the most formidable of obstacles. During the hearings, expressions of love seemed to trump all other human emotions, including fear, grief, and anger at the crimes committed. These stories of love often helped me through the day when hearing after hearing stretched late into the night. When I wavered in my thinking, a family would enter the hearing room and express a love toward the victim so overwhelming and selfless, it renewed my faith and determination to carry on. I went home at night and hugged my wife and children with a new intensity, ready to conduct more hearings the next day. That got me.
Well, you read it twice.
And as I think about, and I'll have more to say about this at the end, but as we in this community ask each other, what can we do to improve the quality of civil discourse in our community, it would do us well, in my opinion, to think about that passage that I just read from your book. So I thank you for that. Let's move on a little bit. I just want to talk very briefly about the Virginia Tech situation, which differed from the 9/11 fund in that 9/11 was taxpayer funded. Virginia Tech, which is a terrible tragedy, the fund was entirely from private donations.
That's right. In fact, every one of these funds that I've administered are all private, except 9/11. Virginia Tech, the Pulse nightclub shootings in Florida, the Boston Marathon bombings here in Connecticut, Sandy Hook, and the murder of those first graders a few years ago. All of those programs are privately funded. Never underestimate the charitable impulse of the American people. It's astounding to me. After tragedy, money flows in, sometimes solicited, sometimes unsolicited. But those funds from private giving, individuals, foundations, corporations, those are the funds you distribute. And they all come from private sources, not the government.
And in the Virginia Tech situation, you once again committed to meet with any and all of the victims and their families who wanted to meet.
That's right. The problem with Virginia Tech, you had not unlimited funds. You had $8 million to distribute. And there were 32 deaths and another 20 physical injuries. And how you distribute that money, very limited funds. But you see, that money was all a gift. You could take that money and not sign any release or anything that I won't sue. You can sue if you want. That's a gift from the American people. So we figured out how to distribute money to a small group of survivors and those who died because of the gunman. And we got that money distributed.
And in your book, you point out that you believed that the Virginia Tech, the Hokie Fund, was a success, and one of the most important factors in that success was giving the victims the opportunity to be heard.
That's right. And again, you know, everybody doesn't come to talk with you. There are people, many people, who grieve in private. They don't want to come and see a stranger. They are grieving in private. They fill out the forms, they send in the forms, you send them a check, You never see them, they never want to see you, you move on. Human nature, everybody's different, and you don't push one approach over another approach. Let them decide. And whatever you do, don't tell people when you send them a check, the check can only be used for certain purposes. That's none of my business. You're entitled to receive these funds. What you do with those funds, one lady told me that she was going to take the money. She lost her son, but the other 3 or 4 children, they were all going to go to Disney World to celebrate the life of a lost son. None of my business. Once the money goes out, I have no real say, nor do I want to have any say in how the money should be used.
So I want to take the last few minutes before we open it up for questions from the audience, just to briefly mention the other 2 programs that I did in the introduction, which were the TARP program, the executive pay, where some people erroneously referred to you as President Obama's executive pay czar, and Deepwater Horizon, the BP oil spill that resulted from that explosion. Both of those you did face-to-face meetings for any and all who wanted to meet, which I think you think turned out to be very important. And one thing you mentioned in the book, in the context of each one of these assignments that you took on, how your awareness throughout of the politics was very important. And while on one level, it might be easy for us to say, awareness of the politics, that's okay, fine, I get that. It was a government program, or it was a government-ordered program, whatever. But why in Westport, Connecticut, when I'm having a frustrating conversation with a neighbor about what we do at the beach, what's so important about the politics? Why is politics important?
Politics is the lifeblood of the country. I mean, everything, you know, in some sense is political. Interchange with neighbors or others, it's political. It might be very personal. But what you try and do, and it's not easy, everybody's different. You try and build some degree of trust, some degree of empathy, putting yourself in the other person's shoes, trying to bridge differences. It is it's something that you have to learn. And I have no doubt in my mind today that we're in sore need of some of the lessons we've learned from the 9/11 fund. The 9/11 fund, I read in the newspapers that even during relief for hurricane victims, it's political now. It's become polarizing, just the opposite of the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund. And it's of great concern, it seems to me, that civility and empathy and calm discussion of differences is morphed into something that becomes, you know, politically polarizing and leading to voices screaming. And it's unfortunate, I think, for the future of the country.
So in terms of common threads that run through these different situations we've discussed, you've talked about empathy, listening, face-to-face where possible, respectful language, the importance of considering the small p politics, and how they're all related to one another, that you can't do one without having an impact on the other, and et cetera. And many times through the 2 books, you used a term that I'd never heard before that I'd love for you to talk about for just a minute, communitarian.
The communitarian ethic We are one national community, despite differences. The idea that, as in 9/11, we're looking out for each other. We're one citizenry. I learned that really as a teenager when I was growing up in Brockton, Massachusetts, and President Kennedy said the following. Good way to end this part of it. I'll never forget this. President Kennedy said in 1961, government is not a dirty word. Serving the public interest is a noble undertaking. And my favorite, he said, every single individual in America can make a difference. You don't hear those words today. I mean, we've fallen on hard times, I think. But those lessons that I learned as a teenager have stood me well in times when I wonder whether we can work something out, whether we can reach an agreement, whether it's a major public dispute or a relatively minor neighborhood dispute. Trying to remember those words of President Kennedy, I think are important and help us get to yes on a lot of disagreement.
Okay, thanks, Ken. Let's open it up for questions. If you have a question, over here where Jennifer, with her arms raised, stands by the mic, and your questions for Ken.
By the way, Steve promised me, this is Westport, there'd be very good questions, so.
Well, now there's a lot of pressure. But
Right.
thank you so much for your time. We were just having this conversation on the drive over. It feels like we are losing a shared reality in a lot of the civic discourse that we're having. And in the story you told about Senator Kennedy working with Senators Helms and Thurmond, it felt like at a minimum, there was a shared trust and belief in the institution, whether it was the institution of liberal democracy, lowercase l, lowercase d, whether it was the institution of the Senate. There was a shared reality and a shared belief in institutions. It feels like as the world gets more and more digital, and as a result more and more polarized in many ways, there's not really the shared institutional wisdom, knowledge, and respect, or even a shared reality. So I guess general thoughts on that, disagreements in a civil way, hopefully. And also, if you notice similar trends since your work about 25 years ago.
Of course. What's to disagree with what you just said? I completely agree.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Now, here's what we confront today that makes civil discourse and empathy so difficult. There are new challenges. You have mentioned one, social media. Social media has transformed civility in this country, whereas 25 years ago even, never mind before that, if one had an idea, one was somewhat isolated, however crazy that idea may be. Today, that idea goes across the internet. Millions of people read that, and it fuels this type of provocation. And Senator Moynihan once said, look, when it comes to civility, everybody can have a different opinion about something, but everybody can't have a different view of the facts. Oh, yeah? Senator Moynihan, today there is a disagreement every day on social media and on television, etc., about the facts, not about an opinion, about the facts. And it poses a tremendous challenge to try and drive forward some of what Steve Parrish and Westport Library are trying to promote in terms of civility and peaceful discourse and sophisticated disagreement you're up against formidable forces that make those objectives very difficult to achieve.
Thanks. Next question.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I know at 9/11, I think I remember reading you dispersed the money according to lifetime earnings. And to what effect, to what extent was the dispersion directly related to lifetime earnings, and what other factors were there? Was there other factors like how many dependents people have? And
Very simple. What would the victim have earned over a work life, not a lifetime?
Okay.
We knew from the Bureau of Labor Statistics a policeman retires at 52 and then gets another job. Okay. What would the person who died on 9/11, what would that person have earned over a work life? Add to that number pain and suffering, emotional distress. Now there, we were smart enough to realize everybody's in pain. Everybody's suffering emotional distress. So we had a formula. In addition to lifetime work-life earnings, $250,000 for the death of the victim, $100,000 for each surviving spouse and dependent child. Add that to economic loss, lifetime earnings, equals your check. The average that came out of that, the average award for a death was $2 million, tax-free, average. The average award for a physical injury was $400,000, tax-free, using this formula, transparent, very consistent. And we paid out, in the 33 months, $7.1 billion of the taxpayers' money, and 97% of all the eligible families and victims came into the program.
Okay, now, what was like the upper end of the give out?
Oh.
What was the lower end? I mean for death.
For death. The upper end, we gave out one award for $8 million.
Okay.
That went to a survivor. There was a woman at the World Trade Center who got on the elevator on the 78th floor, and the elevator with 20 other people came down towards the lobby when the plane hit. And the plane knocked the elevator off its rails on the second floor. So the 21 people and the airplane gasoline came down the elevator shaft. The lady, or people in the elevator, there were 21 of them, they pried open the door. The minute they let the oxygen come into the elevator, they were incinerated. 20 of them were incinerated. This one lady from Cantor Fitzgerald, a stockbroker, making a lot of money, she was burned but survived with burns over 85% of her body. She received $8 million.
And a lot of that is pain and suffering as additional.
Pain and suffering,
Okay.
horrible.
Okay.
But I mean, that was, and the lowest, probably in order to encourage people, I had discretion. If there was a waiter or a busboy, we deliberately incentivized them to stay in the fund. So instead of giving them maybe $400,000, we gave them $1 million in order to keep them in the fund so they wouldn't go off and start litigating the cases.
Okay.
And Ken, if I recall correctly, there was some compression of the awards at the very upper end.
I was sued. See the movie. People at the high end said, look, if you do I lost my wife. She was a 32-year-old stockbroker making $2 million a year. You owe me $35 million. Mr. Jones, I'm not giving taxpayer money out, $35 million. I'll be crucified. I'm reducing it, my discretion, to $6 million, $5 million. Well, some of those Cantor Fitzgerald people sued me. But because the statute gave me discretion, the courts threw out the case and said, Feinberg has the discretion, and he'll exercise it. You can't let 10% of the people get 90% of the taxpayers' money. There'd be a riot, and we had to take that into account.
Yes, sir.
Yes, Mr. Feinberg, for those of us who participate in mediation as lawyers, and perhaps for those who hire lawyers and end up in a mediated setting, what do you think are qualities, skills that are valuable for lawyers to have to make mediation effective? And of course, the opposite of that, what subverts the process?
A mediator should exhibit certain characteristics. Competence, I understand the case. Determination, I'm here and I'm going to get this done as long as you parties are willing to keep trying. I'm not quitting at 2 o'clock. Creativity. I find that when people have a disagreement, there is more than one way to get a resolution. It doesn't always mean splitting the baby or coming up with a compromise that's right down the middle. Be creative in coming up with out-of-the-box thinking about solutions. Very important, I think. And then we get back to my favorites. Empathy. I'm not sure a lawyer's skills are as important in mediation as personal skills concerning empathy and sensitivity and compassion. Not always characteristic of lawyers. You have sensitivity and compassion, but I think that that's very, very important. And sort of have an understanding of where you want to try, what constitutes getting to yes, the process. How are we going to do this? And more often than not, if you follow this menu, you'll reach an agreement. You'll reach an agreement.
What about lawyers on either side? Do you think the qualities are the same, or you think some guys are just better at it than others?
Well, look, lawyers, if you're going to be a lawyer who's an advocate and is a hawk and a warrior, with all due respect, they're not going to help get a mediation accomplished. They want blood. But there are many, many lawyers, most lawyers. I'm a lawyer. I think the profession has been very noble and effective in mediation. In fact, sometimes the clients they represent are so at war with one another. You need the lawyers to try and build bridges to get to yes. So I think, depending on the lawyer, of course, but depending on the mediator, I think that lawyers serve a valuable function in mediation.
Thank you. Great.
Yes.
Hi, hello, good evening. I'm asking this question as a parent. You mentioned that President Kennedy's words impacted you as a teenager. I'm wondering if there are other qualities about your upbringing or your young experiences that you felt, or teachings that you felt equipped you for this important role.
I'll tell you one. I was part of an extremely loving family. No matter whatever my misbehavior in grammar school and high school, no matter some of the steps I took that were at odds with what my mother or my father might have suggested, I always, always knew that my home was a safe haven. And my folks and my sister and my brother, we circled the wagons during misfortune, and every family has plenty of misfortune. And that assuredness that I had, that no matter what I might decide ultimately to do, my family was behind me 100%, made a huge difference. Also, you know, I grew up in the 60s and the 50s when the country was so optimistic. It was such a great time to be an American. in the 50s and the 60s until Vietnam changed everything. But I must say, I was lucky to be reared in a Brockton community where everybody did believe in the communitarian ethic and everybody did rally around each other to help. And I was very, very fortunate in that regard.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hello, Mr. Feinberg. I am also an attorney from NYU Law, and very proud. When I went to law school, believed very strongly in the rule of law, but it's been very distressing in the last few years to see so much of society start to actually question that very basis. And I'm wondering, with you and all of the wisdom that you've gained over the years, have any thoughts on how we may restore the luster of the law in the eyes of the public?
Do we have another 4 hours? I'll tell you one thing. We need in this country vigorous and principled leadership at every level of government and in every society, every village, and leadership. And it's apolitical. I remember President Kennedy as a leader. I also remember President Reagan as a leader. The image that's conveyed, the city on a hill, the idea of the rule of law, you remember, or maybe you've read, and some of you remember, the greatest steps we took towards a principled immigration policy. President Reagan pulled that off with Senator Kennedy and others. And I think it starts there. I also think that, everybody understands there are basic societal divisions, financial, cultural, that have to be bridged in a civil manner. It's just words. How you implement that is for the current and the next generation. Sometimes I think I live too much remembering yesterday rather than tomorrow, but you soldier on, and you try and do the best you can. So one way to start is to, around the country, there ought to be more Westport Library opportunities. Seriously. This is very civilized, and I think very, very useful.
We'll ask you to come to the next RTM meeting. Thanks, Sherry. Further to Sherry's point, in the book, you point out that as successful and beneficial as matters of public policy as the 9/11 fund, the BP oil spill fund, the Agent Orange resolution, as important as they were, those were the exceptions, and they should not become the rule. That you truly wholeheartedly believe in our little legal system and the way it can operate.
That is absolutely a great ending point. The 9/11 fund, you'll never see that again. And I don't think you should. Bad things happen to good people every day in this country. There's no 9/11 fund. You should have seen some of the letters I got during 9/11. Dear Mr. Feinberg, my daughter died in the basement of the World Trade Center in the original 1993 attacks by the very same type of people. Where's my check? Dear Mr. Feinberg, my wife last year saved 3 little girls from drowning in the Mississippi River, and then she drowned to heroin. Where's my check? Steve Parrish is absolutely right. One can think about these funds and really study the process, which is universal, I think, civility and empathy. The funds themselves are really one-offs, and I don't think they're much of a precedent for anything. the process of solving those problems. There's the precedent, not the funds themselves. So that's the great lesson that you've highlighted at the very end here.
Thank you, Ken. I just, one other observation, and then I want to thank you for being here. One of the things that struck me through both books was in each and every one of these issues that you became involved with, there were controversies. You had your critics, and sometimes the criticism got personal. But from my reading of the book and my knowing you through those times, without fail, you treated your critics with respect. You spoke out in your own defense and in defense of the policy and the funds and those who you were trying to help, but you were respectful of the critics. And I think that approach, that attitude contributed to the success of those funds. So I'll stop my lecture there and say, Ken, you know, your service has been, to me, invaluable, and I cannot thank you enough for what you have done and how you have done it. And I thank you for being here tonight and sharing your experiences and your wisdom with all of us. Thanks very much.